So now you're going to hear from some wonderful panelists, and we have a fabulous moderator to help us out. And so I'm going to quickly introduce Melvin Barnes Jr. And if you want to come up here and sit behind while Melvin was born and raised in Toledo and initially joined Ohio Humanities as a summer research fellow in 2019 before joining the team permanently as a program officer in 2020. In addition to his work at Ohio Humanities, Dr. Barnes teaches history at The Ohio State University and is a guest lecturer at Spelman College. Barnes completed his doctorate in Chinese and East Asian history and African American history from The Ohio State University in 2020. Welcome, Dr. Barnes. Next, we have James Hardiman, who is a storied civil rights attorney here in Cleveland. And if you want to come up, Mr. Hardiman. Mr. Hardiman has an extensive legal career, including working at the Legal Aid Society of Cleveland, Office of the Cleveland Police Prosecutor, National NAACP as special counsel, managing partner of Hardiman, Buchanan, Howland, and Trivers, adjunct professor of political science at Baldwin Wallace University, and legal director of the American Civil Liberties Union of Ohio. Welcome, Mr. Hardiman. And we have Marilyn Sanders Mobley, PhD. Come on up, Dr. Mobley. It feels a little bit like you're coming on down for The Price is Right. Dr. Mobley is an emerita professor of literature at Case Western Reserve University, right where we are today, where she served as the university's first chief diversity officer. A Toni Morrison scholar, Dr. Mobley is the author of Folk Roots and Mythic Wings in Sarah Orne Jewett and Toni Morrison, and Toni Morrison's Beloved, The Scandal That Disturbed Domestic Tranquility, which appears in Scandalous Fictions. Her forthcoming book is Toni Morrison in the Geopoetics of Place, Race, and Belonging, which is coming out this year. And then we have Dr. Carlotta Penn, author and founder of Daydreamers Press. Carlotta is, sorry, I just said that. Author at Daydreamers Press and the founder, but she is a daydreamer who believes in justice and in the power of arts and literature to activate change in the world. Daydreamers Press is the public vehicle for her personal passions and commitments. She brings her experience creating as a songwriter, poet, writer, and in teaching and developing community programs nationally and internationally to her work as a lead curator of content and programming at Daydreamers Press. Excuse me. Carlotta is one of the authors of this beautiful book about the Lincoln School Marchers. Excuse me. And then our wonderful moderator, we have Jenny Hamill, who is with IdeaStream and the host of The Sound of Ideas, and she is going to help pull this all together for us. Thank you.
So I am honored to be here, and was now, having watched the documentary twice, was so moved by the story, surprised that I didn't know anything about it, and just felt immediately that, yes, this was a story that needs to be shared and told, and to talk about ordinary people doing extraordinary things and showing such bravery and courage, and the fact that there are moms and dads and children is really just a moving thing. So. Great to be here with all of you, and I'll start asking questions. So, James, I'll direct this at you. If Brown versus Board of Education provided that separate was inherently unequal and a violation of the 14th Amendment, how did the law-abiding people in Hillsboro justify segregated schools, or were they just committed to breaking the law and not providing an equal education of black children, finding that it was irrelevant?
Well, the simple answer is there weren't very many law-abiding citizens in Hillsboro. I'm being a little facetious in that regard, but the reality is that a lot of people pay lip service to the fact that we have a Constitution and that we should obey the Constitution, it being the fundamental law of the land. But when the Constitution says something that people don't like, they have serious reservations about obeying it. We have a person who aspires to be president again, I'm not mentioning any names, but he takes a very similar approach. I'm a little conflicted in many regards because when I was asked to be on this panel, I did some quick and dirty research, and I looked up some words that were allegedly authored by Thomas Jefferson, which said something to the effect about, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men, only men, are created equal. They're endowed with their creator with certain inalienable rights, among being life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. That is a very uplifting statement for one of our founding fathers. Of course, he was a hypocrite. He was a hypocrite in the sense that he kept Sally Hemings in the basement. He was a hypocrite in that he allowed those words to come out, but he still was a slave owner and didn't even bother to free his slaves after he wrote his will. So there are good people that do bad things. And some of the good people who do bad things also let bad things happen. And I think the people of Hillsboro back in the 50s and 60s let a lot of bad things happen. And I've seen this film clip several times now, and I get mad all over again every time I see it. How could these people of Hillsboro, who profess to be law-abiding, God-fearing people, do this to little children? How could they sleep at night? How could they go to church on Sunday mornings and say that they are Christians or Muslims or whatever they happen to be? I don't think it's possible. So to suggest that people who let bad things happen are all racist is an oversimplification. But there are a lot of racists among us. Some are black, some are white. And the people in Hillsboro had some racist tendencies because they let it happen, and in some cases, encouraged it to happen. That being the case, I have no other explanation other than the fact that they stuck their head in the sand and did a disservice to people that look like me and my children that look a lot like me as well.
Marilyn, I want to ask you, and I used the phrase just a bit ago about, ordinary people doing extraordinary things. What can we take from the example set by these mothers to help build more equitable communities for our kids, facing a lot of adversity and even faces of hate, but they still strive? I'm wondering what you think we can garner from them today.
One of the things I think we can garner from them is activism and advocacy. I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, I'm a great-grandmother, and I know that if I don't advocate for my children and my grandchildren and my great-grandchildren, sometimes nobody else will. And so, as I shared at the earlier event this morning, I was excited about this film because when I was Director of African American Studies at George Mason, I believe when the film actually when the musical came through, I may have been associate provost then, I don't know, at my jobs. But the point is, there was a film there, the musical there by the Cleveland choreographer. I don't know how many of you know Diane McIntyre. But Diane McIntyre, you know her.
That's
yes.
my Aunt Diane.
That's her aunt, Diane. So Diane McIntyre did a musical called Open the Door, Virginia. And the reason I talked to Rebecca about us having this film here is that I heard Reverend Otis Moss talk about the Prince Edward County, Virginia case at a recent civil rights conference at Cleveland State. And I said to him, there's an Ohio counterpart, thinking about Rebecca and Melvin. And so I said, if we get it, we're going to try to get it here in Cleveland. And so I saw the advocacy that happened there, and it made me really interested in this case. The advocacy that happened in the Prince Edward County case was that they chose to close the schools rather than let it be desegregated. And so the young people, the high school students, ended up being the demonstrators, the protesters. And so I was interested in this Ohio counterpart because I believe unless parents advocate for their children, you often will not have the change that you need to see. And I tend to be long-winded, so I don't want to go on and on, but I had to do that kind of advocacy for my own son. When we left here, my son transferred from Hawken. We moved to Sandy Hook in Newtown, Connecticut, and we were warned, check out the schools. And we checked them out, and we were trying to figure out why my son was crying every Monday morning. This is a young man who's really smart, loves school, and we discovered they were putting him in the library because he didn't need the curriculum. And I said, excuse me, he's going to the 4th grade. And so they tried to tell me all about socialization of boys, taking more time. And I said, we don't care. We want him in the 4th grade. So they didn't understand that in addition to it being a predominantly white community, he was doubly ostracized. You know, he didn't know that he was being given some special privilege because he was smart. To him, it was being isolated. And so we had to advocate for our sons. And as I shared earlier today, years ago, when I taught at Shaker High School, I saw parents who did the same thing. They advocated for their children. They formed an organization. Some of you know the Meckler book. She mentions this organization called Concerned Parents. And we met with those parents who said, there's something wrong with the system that there aren't any more black children in honors classes and in AP classes. So I've been an advocate for my own children. I always consider myself an advocate for other people's children, who are mine also. And I think that's probably what is needed now in some new ways. But the film just reminds us that it was advocacy, those mothers deciding, no matter what barriers you put, our children deserve to be educated. And that kind of advocacy is what has always been needed, because people who claim to be law-abiding are not.
Now, Carlotta, I know that you're a mother of several young children, and you distilled this story into a children's book. First, I'm wondering, was there anything about the story that surprised you? I think for me, I've always thought of Brown v. Board as an endpoint in some respects, like the final decision by the highest court in the land. But really, it just kind of opened the way for people to really start the fight for equity and, even just integration. So I'm wondering what surprised you, and then as a mother, why you think it was so important for these mothers to challenge this in the courtroom and on the streets as well.
Yeah. When you say I have several children, it makes it seem like I have a lot more than I have. Just
wait, was that?
I think so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. No, I think when I saw the film, what surprised me was that I hadn't heard the story before.
Right.
I always say that, for Black mothers, advocating as leaders for education for our children is a historical rites of passage. I mean, Dr. Mobley was telling me she read to all of her children in the womb. I did too. And so if we look back even to the days of enslavement, Black mothers were the advocates for education for children and for the community. And so that piece didn't surprise me. And the reason I feel like the book and this film are so important is because the thing that did surprise me that I hadn't heard the story, I think is the tragedy. I'm from Columbus, Ohio, so I'm from not too far from Hillsboro. My mother, was a youngster nearly at the time of these women. And so for me as a Black woman to not have heard this story of educational leadership, of civil rights leadership among people in my own state, that was surprising for me. And I want to say to Rebecca too, when we think about how you mentioned that Brown was the end point when really it was the starting point, it's people who are in positions of influence to amplify stories that help us to learn more so that we can, sort of get on board with change. And so Rebecca is the leader of this organization, and working with the people of Hillsboro to amplify this story is really important. Now you asked about the advocacy in the streets and in the courtrooms. Yeah. So I think on the one hand, in the courts, Black people, we've never doubted our humanity, our belonging on this earth, and our citizenship in this country. And so I think it made sense for the mothers to use the courts, as their right to affirm what they need to be true. that they were citizens, that they had rights, their children had rights to equality. But they didn't live in the courts, they lived in community. And so they also needed to make noise, to be seen and heard in their community, among the people, many of which were trying to withhold their rights or diminish their humanity. And so their neighbors, their friends, their employers, I think they needed those people who weren't those law-abiding citizens to see and to hear them, but also their own community members to see them in the streets and to sort of be inspired by their strength and their perseverance and their persistence that we hear about in that film.
Melvin, as you know, the documentary historian, and I know that you helped, in essence, put this together. I'm wondering, why did integration of the past always stress sending black students to white schools? Why not the other way?
Yeah, there's some fundamental assumptions that are baked into that moment. One of the things that we had come to assume, right, was that in order to improve the education outcomes for black students, that meant sending them to white schools. And one thing that we sort of lose sight of was the fact that there were many black educators who were doing a very lot with little in the places where they were. So that really reveals kind of the way that we thought about integration. And this really changes over time. But in that moment, there was that belief that in order to sort of better those students' outcomes, that they had to leave those, quote unquote, black spaces and move them into white schools. Yeah.
And I'm wondering, James, if you have thoughts on, for those black educators who, again, were fighting an uphill battle, lack of resources, as the students were saying, even lack of the same books with missing pages. I wonder if you are able to describe what their reaction was to the potential of losing careers, losing their jobs in the wake of integrating schools, meaning these black students would go into the white schools.
Well, I think the assumption always has been that all black people were anxious to desegregate and go to white schools. The reality is nothing can be further from the truth. In almost every lawsuit that I've been involved with that dealt with school desegregation, there are black educators, black parents, even black students that resisted the idea of having to be involved in a desegregation effort. And I use the word desegregation as opposed to busing, because busing is a popular misnomer for the desegregation process. And we know that after the Declaration of Independence, most southern states passed various black laws. And it wasn't until Plessy that this was codified by the U.S. Supreme Court. Separate is permissible as long as it's equal. And it was another 60-some years later before the Supreme Court, well, it was less than that, because in 1950, we found that the Supreme Court started to chip away at the separate but equal concept. Mm-hmm. One striking case is Sweat versus Painter. Mm-hmm. In the Sweat case, Herman Sweat was offered a scholarship. They built a school for black people, a law school, so that he would not have to go to the white school at the University of Texas. So they built a school. Now, it's not comparable to the University of Texas. It has limited faculty, limited resources. But nevertheless, they said, if it has to be separate and equal, this is equal. Well, a school with 16 students compared to the University of Texas is not, by any stretch of imagination, equal. So the Supreme Court said that in higher education, that there has to be equality. So the NAACP's initial strategy was to make sure that if it had to be separate, it was in fact equal. And that was even before Brown. So when we get to Brown, we start to learn that separate by its very definition is unequal and a violation of the 14th Amendment Equal Protection Clause and due process. So this has been an ongoing process. By the time we filed the Cleveland case in 1973, I think I was 1 year old at the time. But when we filed the Cleveland case, there was a lot of resistance, not just among the white community, but among the black community as well. Some of you may remember Arnold Pinckney. Time was president of the Cleveland Board of Education. Some of you may remember John Bustamante, who opened the bank, and they were part of this. Oh, George Forbes too. They were all part of this coordinated effort to run us out of town. Now, I've been in Cleveland all my life, but still I was perceived as a carpetbagger because of the fact that I was part of the group that was saying there was something wrong with the Cleveland public school and the Cincinnati public school and the Hillsboro. Something wrong if they have a system that requires or permits racial segregation. And we all thought that segregation, after all, was a Southern problem, right? When the great diaspora occurred, people came from the South in droves, black people, I mean, get away from the cotton fields so that they could come to the land where honey flowed in the streets. And a lot of black people bought into that. And the factories were hiring, World War II was in progress. You could find a job here. We thought that there were no laws, except for Hillsboro and a couple of isolated instances in communities where segregation was required. But schools, particularly in large cities, were able to effect segregation in different ways. They drew boundary lines along racial lines. They assigned black teachers to predominantly black schools. They incorporated residential segregation into the schools. They had special transfers that would let white students get out of going to an all otherwise black school. They had optional attendance zones. The student could opt to go to school A or school A, or school B. You know where the white students are going to go, which would leave the other school. There were a lot of techniques, and there was a lot of concern. And we get into the debate about, what about the HBCUs? Have an HBCU, isn't that better than sending students to an environment that they are not welcome in? But that's a debate for another day.
Marilyn, scholars have noted that the battle for integration in America is still incomplete. As a longtime educator, what persistent challenges have you seen across your career as it pertains to equitable education and integration?
Well, one of them I just named that affects how people get into colleges and universities, and that is who gets access to advanced placement classes, who gets access to honors classes. And then we know in higher ed, there's also access to financial aid and financial support. I'm so happy about the Fred Ray Scholar. Because sometimes you have to figure out, we just talked about this morning, how do you get access when the Supreme Court is saying you can't have set-asides, you can't have affirmative action, some of the things that have made it possible for many of us to get into higher ed. And so the example I gave earlier was at Columbia University. I went to Barnard, and Columbia and Barnard are the same in some ways, and so we started a new scholarship, but we put it in Africana Studies because we were told immediately we could name it after this activist who had gone to school with us, and we couldn't name it after him because people thought it was only going to go to black students. And so some of the ways that we attempt to make financial resources available are constantly being scrutinized and shut down before they're even put into place. And so I would say we've had to be very strategic over the years and find ways to make it possible for people to get access, especially now. The example that comes to mind is what's happening around book banning. I've been reminding people about the African American Policy Forum that Kimberly Crenshaw started because she's on a campaign to bring out every book that's been banned and have it taught. And the English professor and me brought books today. I'm a Toni Morrison scholar. I recommend that you read the only short story Toni Morrison wrote. It's called Recitative. And in Recitative, she has mothers on a protest line on opposite sides of the of the debate in Newburgh, New York. So I appreciate the reference to thinking it's only in the South. No, it's in the North. It was in the North, and this is upstate New York. But she put this in the book on purpose. This book was published the story was published in 1980. I also recommend, so my answer is partly reading. So I recommend that people read Can We Talk About Race and Other Conversations in an Era of School Resegregation by Beverly Tatum. She wrote the other book, Why Are All the Black Kids Sitting Together in the Cafeteria? But this book, she's a former president of Spelman, but her attitude is we have to talk about resegregation and what new strategies we need since that has happened. I also recommend that, you all probably know this in the law school, but All Deliberate Speed by Charles Ogletree, because the response to desegregation was all deliberate speed came and then go slow was what he said it looked like. It looked like go as slowly as you can. And then the last book is another Toni Morrison one. She wrote Remember, The Journey to School Integration, which is a children's book. And so I think part of what we have to begin doing is finding other sources so that people have resources to go and being sure that they have access to the education, even if they're in school districts where people are trying to ban the books or change the curriculum. We have to be advocates for what they need to know and for new sources, new resources so that they can get the education that they deserve.
So Marilyn Carletta is talking about, some of the books that she is recommending. I'm wondering, these are hard histories that we're learning through this documentary and in other ways, unknown histories that are obviously important to our understanding of the way our country works. Why do you think it's so important that we teach this hard history to our children, and how do we do it in a way, the 50s are seeming longer and longer ago, and it's just such a different time, and the kids with the social media, it just seems like different worlds. But what can they garner from what we learn through some of this hard history of the past?
Yeah.
And how do we make sure that they don't forget?
Yeah. A lot of times I think when we ask about, or when we think about hard history and teaching it to our kids, we're thinking about how do we bring hard histories about racism to white students or to integrated, groups of students. But I actually struggle with this as a mother to my black kids because I just did not want them to bear the burden of knowing the reality of racism at a young age. And so, and my kids are 7, 6, and 2. And in the early years, I really didn't teach my oldest 2 about racism, even though I understand that children can accept hard things and learn hard things. But I was just really worried about what that would do to their psyche. And so moving on, now a few years down the line, we published Step by Step with Ohio Humanities, and my mother and I did a reading and activity with my daughter's class, which is 2nd grade. And it's mixed, racially mixed, about half white students and half students of color, black students, Asian students, whatever. And they were ready for it. I mean, they were well prepared to receive the history, and they got it and they understood. The project that we did with them was we had them draw self-portraits and then make their own statements. And all of the students had, beautiful, brief statements. Let black people have education. We can do hard things. They were saying all of these things with their statements. And so I believe that the way that we bring hard topics to kids is just to give them the simple truth. And I think that they can understand, children know what it feels like to be treated unfairly, even in their own homes. Anybody who has kids know they're always saying something's not fair, even when it probably is. They know that feeling. Nobody wants to be treated unfairly. Right. So in terms of thinking about race and racial bias and that kind of thing, I think they can understand the importance of equality and treating people fairly at a very young age. And so, but the first half of what I said is, how do we bring that, to our to black children or to children who are a part of oppressed communities? I think is an interesting and different conversation to have. But it goes back to the literature. What I loved about working on this book, outside of just the camaraderie of working with Ohio Humanities and the co-author and the people of Hillsboro, is that this offered me an opportunity to think about, how do I tell this story in a way that will connect to children, where they can really understand just the everydayness of what this meant. Because when we read it and we think about it, I think we're all sitting here thinking about how amazing it was for these women to go, 2 years with their children. But for them, it was just their everyday life. This is what they did. And as you can see in the film, they didn't like it. I can't remember who it is that says, why do we have to do this? And that's in the book.
Right.
We quote that in the book. Why do we have to do this again today when we know we'll be turned away? This was not something these children look forward to. Again, something I think that children can relate to. And so it's just an honor and a really interesting journey to think about telling that story. I think we need a diversity of approaches to telling stories about historical topics in ways that kids can relate to and connect to.
Can I say something about what you just said? I appreciate the way you began by saying you didn't want to do it at first. You didn't want to talk about the hard things, and I believe it is important to tell our children about the hard things as early as we can, and as many, I like your use of the word, in as many diverse ways as we can, because they need to be prepared. I think they need to be prepared for the world they're living in, and I think I have a friend in Connecticut who tried to protect her son, and she tried to protect him, and she accused my husband and I of making our children too sensitive to issues of race. And so we called ourselves educating our son so that they would know there are very few black families here in Newtown, Connecticut, and we wanted them to be aware of what could happen. We didn't say it would happen, we said it could happen. It never did. This other parent who tried to protect her son, tried to keep her son in a bubble, was totally unprepared to be called the N-word. And so she had a harder job. We were prepared, our sons were prepared, and it didn't happen. And so I just think that we need to be honest about the kind of world we're in, and I wish all parents were that way, not just black parents, but that all parents, this is our country, this is some history our country has had. We have just really gotten to a very bad place as far as I'm concerned about the truth and the history that we have experienced. If we use plural pronouns, we have experienced this in this country. We ought to be able to say that, but I think the tendency to protect children is getting us in deeper trouble and keeping the polarization going. It's just a very personal feeling. So I'm glad you came around.
Before we move on, we were speaking to a group earlier today, and one of the questions I asked was, how many people have read Plessy versus Ferguson in the last 10 years? About 3 people raised their hands. How many people have read Brown in the last 10 years? Same people. How many people have read Reed versus Rhodes ever? That's the Cleveland school desegregation case. I would recommend that you go back and read Plessy. Go back and read Brown. May make you mad all over again. But I think it's something that's worth learning, understanding, and trying to appreciate where people were back in 1896, or for that matter, 1954. It's an important lesson, and if we don't understand and appreciate it, in my humble opinion, we're destined to make those same mistakes all over again, and we kind of are walking backwards as I speak. So I think it's important. I'm not speaking to little kids, but I think little kids would benefit from reading Plessy, would benefit from reading Brown, would benefit from those cases. Now, it'll have to be, I use the word dumbed down.
Oh, the picture.
Yeah, okay. But I think it's important for children and adults to understand where we came from, where we are, and where we want to be. That's my opinion moving forward. So go back and read Plessy and Brown and read. See what you think about it. See if you get as mad as I am.
Melvin, I want to ask you, after the Supreme Court decided Brown, the Hillsboro School Board rezoned the district to keep Lincoln an all-black school. Why did private academies and redistricting become so popular after the Brown decision, and how do you think the legacy of those types of moves still apply today?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that I think I can start to speak on, and then maybe James, you can jump in and talk a little bit about this. But as that process of desegregation began to work out, right, that changes how things look on the ground in cities and towns and villages all across the United States, right? And clearly, through rezoning and other tactics, there was a way that people went about reinstilling or reinstating some of what had been the status quo for all of those years, right? So as you now have, through the second Great Migration, African Americans moving into these spaces after Brown, that's precisely at the time that you see, white students moving out, right? And those families are taking those resources with them, and some things that would come up would be private academies, private schools, and again, redistricting and rezoning. So, one thing that it's important for us to remember is that this story has a very long tail. And the way that our communities look today is by no small measure influenced by that Brown decision and those changes to our communities that happened in the wake of them. So it's important to think about how integration has changed the schools that we go to, and look at our school districts now and the places where we decide to send our schools, and ask that question. Why does my part of the town look this way? Is it a diverse part of the community? Where in our cities are resources lacking? And I think you can tie direct connections back to decisions like the Brown decision and how people reacted to it. The good, quote unquote, law-abiding citizens of some of these places.
A lot of people forget the fact that Brown versus Board of Education was not a single case, but it was a consolidation of 5 different cases from Virginia, Delaware, South Carolina, Washington, D.C. But it was all of these cases that came together. The case that was referred to earlier was out of Prince Edward County in Virginia, which is not too far from Richmond, Virginia. That was the case in which they closed the schools to avoid sending black students in. If you have an opportunity, look at Eyes on the Prize. Have you ever seen it or heard of it? It's by Juan Williams, and he has one segment that deals with what went on at Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas, where they closed the schools down, and they let the black kids go in, but all the money and all the white kids were going to the white private academy. And they interviewed some of the students that are now 70-ish, and they talked about what it felt like to get up and go to a school where nobody was there. To go to a school where the only people that they saw were National Guard and who were able to protect them, and all of the atrocities that happened and the lack of education that was going on. A good friend of mine is from Little Rock, and I stopped in Little Rock once, just 8 or 9 years ago, and I wanted to see Central High School, just to see it. And there's a gas station that has been converted into a museum. So my friend, when he went there, he got a little plaque which said Central High School, Little Rock 9, and he gave it to me. I said, "Oh, I really appreciate that." He said, "It's $10. I said, "Wait a minute, you're my friend." He said, "It's $10 because I'm your friend." So I think that it's a strategy, and massive resistance was the rule rather than the exception. And many of the school board members and citizens supported that strategy so that they could avoid having to send white kids to a previously all black kids into a white school with desegregation.
I don't know if now we might open up the question portion to the audience if anyone has a question. I think we have a couple of microphones that if you do have a question, just raise your hand and wait for a microphone to come to you. Anyone with a question?
Do we know what happened to the teachers at Lincoln during the 2 years of the walkout and subsequently after desegregation?
Yes. So there, I believe there may have been two teachers at Lincoln at the time. One of them, I don't think either were employed in Hillsboro after that. I think one of them ended up teaching in, I believe it was in the Dayton area, perhaps. Is that right, Alex? Thumbs up. Yeah. So
Sorry, not all of the students at Lincoln School were part of the march. So during the march, there were still some students who attended Lincoln School. So the teachers there were still, they had their jobs throughout this, but they were part of the court case. They were called as defendants. And they certainly couched their feelings on it.
Any other questions?
I have a question.
Wait for the microphone. Thank you.
I'm a high school teacher, 31 years, so I can be loud. I'll try to hold back here. So, watching this story and listen to you speak, it's been a pleasure hearing you, so thank you for everything that you've shared. What disturbs me is that this story should be in school curriculum, and I don't think it is. Is there anything being done to get it in curriculum?
I can actually answer that. Actually, as of today, so we are working with an educational distributor called Bullfrog, who's going to be able to distribute the film with educational materials. So that will get added to our website and to the Lincoln Story .com, which everybody can find on the back of this. But that's going to be the best way to get it in a school. It'll have curriculum to go along with it. The film will be accessible there. So yes, we're working on that, but it's not currently a story that's widely taught in schools. And I would say at your school, if you're interested in screening the film, we're doing a screening for an entire high school sometime next month. We would, sorry to just jump in on the panel, but definitely reach out to us, because these are the kinds of events that we definitely want to be having at schools.
You'll recall that not too many years ago, there was a big push for black education. But that black education was primarily focused on black students. My position is that that kind of education, no matter what we call it, should be required for all students, because white students probably need to learn this lesson as much as what black students do. And we missed that boat altogether. They should know about Plessy, Brown, Hillsboro, Cooper versus Aaron, what led up to Brown, who Thurgood Marshall was, those kinds of things, because it's important. And unfortunately, our students, both black and white, in far too many instances, don't know the history.
That's the very reason I was saying first person plural. This is our history. We all need to know it, and to have one group of people knowing and another group not knowing when we're all still living in the same country, in the same school districts, passing one another on the street, it makes no sense. And it puts us as a nation, puts democracy in peril, as far as I'm concerned.
What school do you teach at?
Independence High School.
What's the racial composition at Independence High?
I don't know offhand. It's not what it should be.
Just roughly, what do you think?
85% white. 85%
I
white.
mean, it's 50% other.
Yeah, there's others as well.
It's more than I thought. So.
This is a question for Mr. Hardiman. We're in a law school. I'm getting CLE credit for this. In many ways, this story is a story about the failure of the law and the failure of Brown to immediately affect change, and really about the power of advocacy. And my question for you as a civil rights attorney is, what role do you see for lawyers moving forward in perhaps collaborating with activists? Like, what role do you see in the power of the law to shape our future?
I'm very disillusioned. As you probably know, Brown was divided into two different cases. There was Brown 1, which basically said separate is inherently unequal, 1954. in Brown 2 that required the school district to desegregate with all deliberate speed. That was 1955. Well, from 1955 to 1964, didn't much of anything happen except they closed down a lot of schools to avoid sending black kids to these previously all-white schools. It wasn't until the 70s that we started to file lawsuits in places like Charlotte, Denver, Colorado, Detroit, Cleveland, Boston, in hopes that we could make a sea change. And I'm the first to admit it, going backwards. Because I just read, and I haven't read the case yet, but I just read the other day that in Alexandria, Virginia, Asian students had a lawsuit that was decided by the circuit court. The Supreme Court refused to hear it. And it would have had the effect of increasing the Asian population in this particular school, which I understand is about 70% Asian. And the Asian said that by controlling attendance, it discriminates against Asian students, which probably does on some level. Whether it's legal or not is another story. So the fact that the Supreme Court refused to hear that case and let stand the status quo, it's kind of a breath of fresh air. Now, once I read the case and get mad all over again, I may change my mind on that. But I'm not very optimistic about the court as we now have.
And I'd like to say something on that too. I'm not a lawyer, so you can disregard what I say here. But in reading some of the correspondences between the members of the Supreme Court, as they were coming upon this decision, it became very clear that having a unanimous decision was important because of the sort of gravity of the decision that they were going to make.
Stephen Brown.
Yes, yes. And one thing that's, part of getting to that unanimous decision was making some compromises. So that having Brown 2 and using that language of all deliberate speed, which is deliberately vague, right? I think part of that was this understanding that they knew that this was going to be a very monumental decision that had ripple effects, especially in the South. And they factored in that you could not tell Southern school districts that they needed to immediately integrate. So all of this is a part of giving people time to adjust to this new reality. In terms of how lawyers and lawmakers and all of you move forward with this, I think it's the idea that you cannot compromise on doing what is right. And if it meant that you needed to immediately integrate, then you had to deal with that in that moment, because by postponing it and not being forceful with your decision, you made it so that the mothers had to pick up the slack that the court didn't do. So I think it's just that you have to be willing to say, we cannot compromise on some issues, right? And I'm not the lawyer, so I leave it to you all to figure out how that comes out in the wash. And then in terms of, especially how this affects the country more broadly. There was another case, I believe it was Lum v. Rice, which was, maybe 1926. And one thing that teaches us is that, a lot of our laws were written for, with white folks and black folks in mind. But this country is much more diverse than that. And what we have allowed to happen in recent years, and really going back to Lum v. Rice in 26, was that those people in between can get pulled to either side and can become pawns of sometimes maybe not pawns of sort of equity and inclusion, but can find themselves being used for divisive tactics. So I think that it's one, being aware of how these things affect different communities and how we can sort of carefully craft laws around that, but also being uncompromising in our pushes for equality.
I was involved in the Lorraine school desegregation case, and Lorraine has the highest percentage of people of Puerto Rican descent of any other city, I believe, in the country.
Oh.
And the judge, in his wisdom, made sure that the Puerto Rican students, not just Mexican or people from the Dominican Republic, but Puerto Rican students were adequately represented. I was also involved in San Francisco. And if you think Cleveland is difficult, San Francisco has everybody. Pacific Islanders, Asians. When Asians are divided into Japanese, Pacific Islanders, or Chinese, I was under the misguided assumption that, it sounds racist, I know, but Chinese and Japanese would all have similar interests. Wrong. They had been fighting wars for centuries. So we had to make sure that that was addressed. But it is a problem. It's not, in Cleveland, it was primarily black and white. But in other communities, it's not necessarily black and white. It's black and white and other is divided into several different subcategories. So that's something that we have to be mindful of moving forward.
James, I wonder, with all the knowledge and all the history that you've had here in Cleveland with Judge Battisti and all the others, how would you compare the two? The case that we just saw as opposed to the civil rights and the things that we had to go through here in Cleveland?
Well, a couple of basic distinctions. The Hillsboro case was shortly after Brown. Brown was 1954, Brown 2 was 1955. Hillsboro, I believe, was 57. Cleveland had a school desegregation case called Craggett. And in the Craggett case, I think that was 64, if memory serves me correctly. But in the Craggett case, schools were segregated, and they were requesting that the judge rule that the segregation was unconstitutional. Instead, the judge said, this segregation is okay because children are being assigned to neighborhood schools, and all of the things being equal, which they never are, then children should be going to their neighborhood school. Well, the reality is, kids that go to Hawken University, St. Ed, St. Ignatius, Hathaway Brown, they don't go to their neighborhood schools. But they know that at the end of that bus ride, there is something better and a quality education. Now, the reality is in Cleveland, we don't have that. You know, is a kid from Fairview Park going to get on a bus to go to East Tech? I don't think so, for the most part. So how do we create an environment that would make kids want to go there? One of the ideas was we'll make every school a magnet school. Make it a magnet school where kids want to go there. In some cases they would. We had a school on the lakefront. Remember Aviation High? Our thought was that, okay, everybody wants to be a pilot, that's cool. I saw Top Gun. So if we make that a magnet school, kids will be clamoring to get into that school. It didn't work out that way. And one of the desegregation administrators was advocating for all schools to be magnets. One school would be a medical magnet. Another school would be an aviation magnet. A third school might be a STEM magnet. And by the time we filed the Reed versus Rhodes Cleveland case, we kind of were thinking that we might be talking about a metropolitan remedy, not just a Cleveland remedy, because the reality is the population in Cleveland is shrinking, has been shrinking for many years now. So if we had a metropolitan remedy, would that start to address some of the problems? Well, the Detroit case kind of shot that down, Milligan versus Bradley. So by the time we filed the Cleveland case in 1973, by the time the judge ruled and we started the remedy, the population of Cleveland schools had changed significantly. And then, as we all know, the president appoints people to the Supreme Court. He ain't going to appoint somebody that's going to be in favor of things he doesn't like or she doesn't like. Therein lies a big part of the problem.
Fortunately, I think we are out of time. We have one hand. Can I ask? All right, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Is it on? Yeah. First of all, Dr. Penn, this is a beautiful book. And I have the hardback copy. One of the things I was really impressed about is that I felt like the marchers wanted to not only give respect, but honor to the parents, their mothers who marched with them. And then I think about how, because it is in this form now, a children's book, I just really heard about Lincoln schools maybe 2 months ago, but there are children now who will know this part of our history. It's all about timing too. If I can just quickly say that I was a Cleveland student in the elementary school in the late 50s and early 60s. And Mr. Hardiman, I know I definitely need to talk to you about these cases and how come, what was done with my group, how it ended up the way it was. And basically it was that we did go to neighborhood schools, but if you had a neighborhood school that could only hold 1,500 students and you have 3,500 students, what do you do then? And so at some point in time, we do have a movie, but we might have a book as well about my experience of going to a school after the white students had already been let in. And then during that time, this is for 3 years, because I ended up actually going to 11 schools in 7 years. But during that time, we had to be in our own separate hallway. We weren't allowed to interact with the white students at all. We couldn't see the nurse. We didn't have any programs or school pictures or any of that. And this is the reason why I'm talking about it in history terms, is because we didn't talk about it as students after that. And not until we're doing research now did I know all the things that were going on during that time went on. So I would like to make sure that we are letting our children know about our recent history, as well as whenever I used to tell my students that I went to see Dr. Martin Luther King over at Glenville, they automatically put me in with the Abraham Lincoln Group as well. So we have to let them know that there's, like their grandparents who might be in their 60s and early 70s, that we are part of history too, and to share that history. So you did a great job with this book. Thank you.
Thank you.
In the Reed versus Rhodes decision, the liability decision, much of what you just described was used to show that the Cleveland schools were liable, not just on a de facto basis, but on a de jure basis, for fostering and creating racial segregation. So what you described has already been addressed. It was addressed when people testified how when there would be intact busing, they would take kids from Huff, send them into Murray Hill. They would take kids from Linville, send them into Collinwood. Teachers would, if a student was good, they would put a star on his forehead. They wouldn't let them have recess with the other kids. They couldn't go into the auditorium. So that is reality. And I implore you, after you read Plessy and Brown, read the Reed decision.
I'm going to, and the last one too. Thank you.
And I just want to add to that. You mentioned, the history. I think one of the things Rebecca mentioned early on is that the women of Hillsboro, who were marchers at the time, really wanted this story to be told to the next generation, to children of today. And they told me in one of our talks that they hadn't told their own children for many years. And that's another reason why it was so important for them to have their story told in the form of a picture book, because of that gap in their own experience with sharing their story with their children. And so that they were finally ready to tell their story and really wanting it to, really wanting all children to know the story, you're right, is really important. And that's why we did the book in the form of a scrapbook or a picture book, memory book, to kind of re-emphasize the idea of cherishing our memories, holding on to our memories, and sharing our memories, passing them down.
So if you want more information on this wonderful story and the things that Ohio Humanities is doing, everyone has a card in front of you. Please feel free to fill that out. You can drop that off with Alex, and you will be entered into a raffle where you may receive an Ohio Humanities grab bag. So yes, everyone, please share this story as widely. I'm sorry, not with Alex. Either side? Okay, either side. And we just love to stay in touch with you all as we continue to share this story and all those things.
Where can we purchase Dr. Penn's book? Is it outside? Okay.
Upstairs.
I'll do a few, let me wrap it up, and then I'll do a few announcements before we can,
I think we're wrapped. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I love the enthusiasm of this crowd. So thank you all so much. Thank you again to our wonderful panelists. Jenny did a beautiful story yesterday on Sound of Ideas where she actually interviewed one of the marchers, Teresa Williams. So if you'd like to hear some more stuff that you didn't hear in the film, please check out Sound of Ideas on IdeaStream. We will be selling the book here. We can do Venmo, Cash App, Zelle, cash, and checks. And so we've got copies of the books here. We're going to take a few photos with our panelists, but we do have a reception outside, upstairs, excuse me. Certainly not outside. That was ridiculous. But then you'll be able to ask. I know some more people had questions, but our team and the panelists will be there, and I hope that you'll interact. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you.
Okay,